So back to that point, I agree with what you said because I think when it gets that cold, uh, there's not enough necessarily heated van capacity, right?
Hmm. Oh yeah,
There
yeah,
isn't enough, so that puts more pressure on the refrigerated capacity. But then I think that whenever we're talking storms or disasters, the first thing that comes to mind is food. That comes to mind
absolutely. You're right.
because
Yeah.
I get a little hangry if I miss a meal here and there. So I would assume that everybody else feels the same way. What are your thoughts, Joe? Do you get a little hangry?
Skinny guy like me, no. I'm
Yeah,
fine.
I see. It's a metabolism you got, Joe. But I think we've seen some extremes. I would also say that depending on the driver pool, the lack of drivers, the drivers exiting the market for multiple different reasons, a lot of those drivers were in the least desirable position, which is pulling a refrigerated trailer and working food service and working produce in those markets because that's the hardest seat to fill, right, Eric?
Oh, it definitely is. I mean, anything that is becoming more of a traditional longer haul type of an environment becomes more difficult, and so that is definitely an area that is an issue. And when you're going into weather related areas, you just know that you are going to potentially be stuck, and so you're going to be out on the road for a while, and nobody's overly excited about that. So yeah, you're absolutely correct.
And the rates go up, but I think the rates have been so unsustainably low for so long. The great freight recession we've been navigating through here.
Yes.
It, I think that when these things happen, the pendulum goes too far, right? Because the in some respects, I don't blame them.
Yeah, and I'll, this that kind of brings up a good point. So one of the things that we've kind of talked about is that this particular cycle has not been a traditional freight recession.
Nope.
It's for us, it's not a freight recession. It is a rate recession. So it's not that freight has collapsed, it's that the rates have collapsed. And so it makes it very difficult for people who are operating in a certain environment a couple years ago to come back and say, "Oh, I can operate in that environment again." In this newer environment at a lower rate level. And for a lot of them, they can't. Um, but it has been very surprising for us to see how many companies actually continue to keep operating. And one of the things that we have looked at very closely is the change in the carrier population. So we saw going into COVID, we saw a huge surge of number of carriers. But that was because the rate started going up and everybody goes, "Oh my God, I can make money in here." But what were they doing? They were buying equipment at inflated rates. They were doing all these crazy things. And
Top
so
dollar.
that's exactly it. So we saw a huge surge in the amount of capacity based upon the carrier population. And a lot of that was owner operators, one truck, two truck, three trucks. And then we have recently, since over the last several years, we saw it that start to contract a little bit, but not to the level where you got rid of all those people. And in fact, we're still now kind of treading water between adding carriers and subtracting carriers. So it's been the overall total number of carriers out there has been fairly high still. So it's kind of a conundrum for us because we're trying to figure out why that's the case. Because when you look at the amount of freight in the system, you look at the cost structure in the system, there's a lot of things that suggest that you should see more carriers going out of business than or at least losing their being having revocations. And so we're not just looking at bankruptcies and things like that. We're saying who lost their authority, because I think that's the most important thing on that, and truck insurance premium costs. And so this is one of the reasons why we thought we would see more companies shutting their doors than we have. We have seen huge amounts of increases in insurance premium costs. And that's really not sustainable. It has leveled out recently, which is good to see, but it's just very difficult to see how a traditional carrier, a smaller carrier, can continue to pay these higher premiums and continue to make it. It's very, very difficult.
No, this is great information because this goes back to what we've been talking about. I don't know how. So if we start to see what we're seeing now with carriers not replacing equipment, maybe in 26, because here you look at the graph, right?
Yeah. Yep.
You've got fraud and theft in the industry at a massive high, and I think that's probably a huge makes a huge impact on insurance premiums. And then you have the driver pool situation getting narrowed down. So I think we're closer to equilibrium than many people realize. But
I would agree.
to
No.
your point, I still think we need a driver of more volume or an uptick in the economy from a manufacturing perspective to push to drive the bus, right?
Oh, yes. For anything to be sustainable, if we start thinking about a recovery, because there's been, yes. So let me finish that comment. So for anything to be sustainable, it has to be the freight market, period. If the freight market doesn't recover with you and continue to see upward growth, then any short-term gains then eventually go away. And I know that there's been a huge amount of talk, depending on which side of the equation you're on. So when we hear from, a carrier, right? You hear from a fleet, well, they would like to see things tighten up. They would like to see capacity coming out of the system so that they can see rates going up. If you're a shipper, you're like, I don't want that, right? I like to keep my rates as low as possible. And
Yeah, they've had the 3.5 year clawback to this point.
Yes, correct.
And I think they think that that's attainable moving forward. And I would argue that that's not a recipe for success.
No. So a lot of times what we're trying to instruct people is to be pragmatic about what's happening right now, but also then start to plan for the future to say, okay, what is a realistic expectation of what the market conditions are going to do? So when people are going out for bid and so forth right now, if a shipper says, hey, I think rates are going to decline even further, then you're kind of doing a disservice to yourself. I mean, because then you're like, well, why? I mean, it might be a perfectly good gamble for you, and it might pay off. But from a risk perspective, when you start assessing the risk, the likelihood is not there. But when you start to say, okay, well, what is a 2%, a 3% rate increase look like? At minimum, we would at least tell people you have to build in a inflationary rate increase, no matter what. So that basically puts you at a 2 to 3% rate increase on an ongoing basis. And then from there, then you have to say, okay, how much premium am I going to pay relative to locking in capacity?
Well, you make a great point there. But we've seen a market where it's been a clawback for years.
Correct.
So we didn't get 3% in 23.
Correct.
We didn't get 3% in 24. We surely didn't get 3% in 25. If we don't plan for it, so I've talked to some shippers. I'll share this information with you and everyone else.
Oh yeah, that's just between us. Is that you're not? Oh, okay. Good.
No, I share it with everyone. But what I was going to say is, most of the intelligent shippers that I've talked to were budgeting for 10% by the end of the year, and they know that they may not need it now in the refrigerated side, but I think by the end of the year they know that's a recipe for success. And then some have private fleets top offset, and they're still budgeting at 7.5 because they're just waiting for when this year it's going to flip.
Yeah.
And then I've got some shippers that say we're budgeting flat, which it's like, hey, wait a minute. At some point in time, you've driven so much downward in the supply chain that you're going to erode your supply chain, and then it's going to get really bad moving forward. So to your point, there should have been some increases, inflationary increases that shippers haven't wanted to give.
Yeah.
And the capacity situation was a surplus, so they took advantage of that as the clawback.
No, I mean, and your point is well taken on that. So we clearly are looking at some increases in rates. So some of it comes down to expectation of what the absolute rate level should be versus the year-over-year growth. And so what I find more important right now is what is that year-over-year growth? And I think that's what most shippers are kind of looking at too. And right now, when we look at contract rates, they have still been fairly stalled out. I mean, you're seeing some rate growth, but not substantial. It's not until we get to the end of 2026 that we start to see some rate increases. But even then, we don't expect that we get even up to 4%. And that's the crazy thing. Now, the longer this, whatever the heck this is, right? The longer that the economy continues to stay stalled out in the environment that we're in, the higher of likelihood that we have a hockey stick type of a return. So, and that's the harder part to articulate is when does that happen and what does that look like? And right now, we're not forecasting that. But at the same time, I think companies need to be prudent and say, I need to do some what if scenarios, right? I need to say what happens if this occurs and that the freight market picks back up and the capacity, tightens and all of those types of things. So the base case that we're looking at here, that 3 to 5% type of a number is good for planning longer term, but it's not great for when you're trying to say what if scenarios. One of the things I have struggled with is to be able to articulate how do some of these policy and social things play into the broader economy. And it's very difficult to do that and articulate it because some of these are erosions of norms that we're trying to say, how does this impact it? What does the consumer do? How do we as a society behave? And those are a lot of behavioral things that are nearly impossible to model. And so I have been probably out of our group is probably one of the most pessimistic as it relates to impacts. And then so we as a collective whole kind of come together in the organization to say, what are those things? But for me, some of the stuff that I kind of worry about is what happens when we talk about cross-border traffic. We've already seen disruptions within that. We've already seen disruptions in how the supply chain works with Canada and Mexico. But it hasn't been as disruptive, I think, as some had feared. But I think that there's more to go. And one of the things that I brought up to my team the other day, and they're like, I have not heard anybody talk about this. And I said, well, that's fine. And so maybe I'm a little bit cuckoo here. But I fully expect that they could shut off border traffic for railroads, for example, and that you now have three distinct markets. You have the Canadian, you have the Mexican, and the U.S. market. Right now, it operates as a unified North American market. If that happens, what does that do to supply chains? And maybe if it's just threatened, what does that do to supply chains? So some of these things that I've been thinking about are not outside of realms of possibility. They may not occur, but at the same time, I'm like, what does that do to how this plays out?